customers over a sustained period of time with a high quality, value for money, market-oriented proposition in relation to Australian barley. And those are exactly the factors underpinned by evidence that we will take through the WTO processes in relation to defending the integrity of our farmers and grain growers and making sure that their rights are upheld through the global trading system.
Minister, overnight the Chinese Foreign Ministry pointed to two specific deals that it had issue with. One was the CK takeover bid for Australian gas pipelines, and the other was the Lion Menu dairy deal. Neither of those deals were recommended to be blocked by the Foreign Investment Review Board on national security provisions. Has Australia left itself vulnerable by blocking business deals for Chinese takeovers without FIRB backing?
Well, Australia's foreign investment laws have always operated on the basis that the Treasurer of the day makes a final decision in relation to whether or not an investment is in Australia's national interest. And this is an important safeguard to ensure that ultimately, not only do we have that national interest test, but public confidence of foreign investment into Australia is maintained. And so those processes, underpinned by FIRB analysis, but ultimately a judgment for the Treasurer of the day, need to consider all aspects around Australia's national interest, take that advice from FIRB, overlay it with other advice and analysis, and ultimately come to a judgment call. Australia remains very much one of the world's most open economies when it comes to welcoming foreign investment. The vast majority of applications that are received for foreign investment are approved, and over the last 12 months, the vast majority of applications have been approved, including the vast majority of applications from Chinese applicants through the FIRB process too.
How long would the WTO process take, and what's the worst thing that could happen to China if found in Australia's favour?
So the WTO processes, as I acknowledged in my remarks, take longer than we would wish to be the case in an ideal world. It could take years. So this is about achieving, as much as anything, a systemic outcome as well as a specific outcome. We want a specific outcome that recognises Australia's grain growers and barley industry operate in nothing other than entirely commercial ways and with the utmost of integrity. But we also want a systemic outcome that identifies the fact that the decisions that have been reached by Chinese authorities lack basis, are not underpinned by facts and evidence, and ultimately leads, we hope, to change in relation to their practices. The WTO processes enable and allow for third parties, for other countries, to become third parties to the processes as well. So we will welcome the participation of other nations through these processes, which will mean that this is not just a matter assessed in relation to the Australian barley industry, but hopefully can give rise to greater confidence in terms of Chinese application of these processes to all nations into the future.
Is it your expectation that other countries might join this and it might become a broader push?
It's quite commonplace for other countries to become third parties to proceedings in the WTO. Australia has done so on many occasions, China has done so on many occasions, and I would anticipate that others would do so on this occasion.
The WTO has been, the appellate court is now down to one judge thanks to Donald Trump, so it's usually got 7, down to 1. So you say it's going to take possibly years. Could it take decades, given that it's been stripped of all resources and practically useless at the moment?
Well, Andrew, you make an interesting point in that question, but it does actually also highlight an important point in relation to both Australia's and China's stated commitments to the World Trade Organisation and its processes. So there are essentially 3 distinct phases that this will go through, assuming there isn't an off-ramp in which negotiation settles the issue. The first phase is the consultation phase, which is a relatively limited process running over a couple of months, where the parties are essentially forced to engage in a consultation, in a mediation, if you like, to see if it can be resolved without having going to the next stages. Assuming that doesn't lead to an outcome, the second stage is the primary phase of considering the case, where a panel is formed in the WTO to consider the arguments and to ultimately form a judgment. Then there is an appeal right, which is what you're speaking of in terms of the appellate body of the WTO, which is currently in a state of dysfunction. However, a number of countries, around 20, worked together over the last year or so to agree upon an alternate approach whilst that appellate body is in that state of dysfunction. Notably, Australia and China both agreed to be parties to that alternate approach. So we do have a functional appeal avenue available if we ultimately get to that stage, and we do so as a result of the fact that both Australia and China have demonstrated a commitment to cooperate with the EU, with Canada and with others at the WTO in addressing this vacuum that exists in relation to its appellate body. And I hope that that mutual demonstration that Australia and China have both shown to the utilisation of the WTO's processes is also underpinned and reflected in the way in which this case is conducted. And ultimately, I again appeal for the fact that just as we have done so with Canada and the wine industry, and just as many others have done so in initiating WTO processes, there is always the ability to pause them and resolve these matters through dialogue instead.
Minister, it's been confirmed that Five Eyes officials are discussing potential joint retaliatory sanctions against China in response to what it has been doing to Australia, or possibly refusing to sell certain products to China that China refuses to purchase from Australia, like coal. Where do you think that level of response fits in with something more formal like the World Trade Organization? Would that be a move that you would support from our allies, given that by your own admission we are potentially entering into a years-long process, whereas this could actually bring China back to the table much faster?
I'll make 2 points there. The first is that Australia respects the proper processes, and we are engaging through the proper processes, and taking this dispute to the next stage of the World Trade Organization is just that. It is a utilisation of the proper processes that we've all signed up to in terms of settling trade disputes. The second point I'd make is that when it comes to the sales of Australian goods, and obviously the disruption that occurs when excessive tariffs are placed as part of an anti-dumping decision, as has been the case in relation to Australia's barley exports and our wine exports to China, of course we have to go and look for alternate markets to support those industries. Our network of trade agreements allows us to do that. Our relationships with other countries allow us to do that, and we will of course do everything we can, and are doing everything we can within our powers through our Austrade, diplomatic and other networks to use those relationships to help our producers find and access successfully those alternate markets.
So this is retaliatory action that other large nations are considering joining in on our behalf. They're stepping up to the plate to help Australia. What's your take on that possibility?
It's for other nations to speak for themselves. I speak for Australia, and Australia is using the proper processes of the WTO and exploring wherever we can the opportunities in alternate markets, using our network of trade agreements and all of our other relationships to give our producers the best possible chance of accessing those markets.
Could this be the first of several cases? Are you looking at bringing similar actions on wine, coal, cotton, seafood, beef, anything else?
It is possible that there could be further actions, and certainly I would reserve all of Australia's rights in that regard. We have a series of different actions that China has taken during the course of this year, and each of them come with slightly different criteria for how you might respond in the WTO. Barley and wine are obviously both using similar criteria in relation to anti-dumping measures, and China's rulings and decisions on those are transparent. We think they're erroneous, but they're transparent, and we've got the ability to be able to respond to those. In relation to other matters, some of the trade sanctions are clearer, such as the use of phytosanitary or regulatory labelling and other standards, and if we don't see appropriate steps taken to be able to resolve those issues in accordance with the agreements and undertakings that we share, well again we could consider further action, including the potential use of the WTO. Others seem to be the application of pressure or market distorting factors within the Chinese system, where businesses within China, often state-owned enterprises, are being discouraged from purchasing Australian goods. Now that of course is a harder point to prove than where there are extensive judgments or rulings that have been made by Chinese officials behind it, and in those areas we will monitor closely all of the trends that unfold in relation to purchasing decisions, watch that closely and see whether that leads us down certain avenues for appeal.
This escalating trade dispute, can you clarify what it's ultimately costing Australia in terms of a dollar figure or hit to our GDP?
Look, the costs obviously depend very much upon just where China chooses to take this, and in saying that I emphasise Australia has not changed our positions in relation to our support for the growth and economic development of China, to our support for a positive relationship between Australia and China, and to our commitment to it being an open trading nation. China has undertaken a number of steps this year. They come at some relatively small thus far macroeconomic cost, but clearly at some direct cost to some of the industry sectors, and with the pressure of shifting volume into other markets and whether or not that impacts upon the price points in those markets. So we are continuing to monitor that very closely with each of those individual businesses. It really is in support of the industries, the businesses and the jobs in those sectors that our priority lies, and that's why we will work as hard as we can to help them find those alternate markets and contracts wherever possible.
But do you have a sort of ballpark figure so far?
Look, the costs obviously affect trade volumes that are in the billions of dollars, but there will be alternate markets for many of those items and opportunities there, which we have to continue to work through to make sure that we get the best possible substitute markets at the best possible prices for those goods and services.
Considering this WTO process could take years or decades, how will this actually help producers or Australian businesses actually caught up in this issue at the moment? Is this about drawing a line in the sand for future disputes, or do you hope that actually lodging these sort of cases might hopefully get China to reconsider their actions right now and here and now?
As I said before, we would hope that this dispute will ultimately resolve the issue in relation to Australia's barley industry, and in the meantime, of course, Australian barley producers will assess whether they plant barley in future years or whether they plant other grains and crops, and we will be working with them in terms of the opportunities for them to pursue avenues to sell into other markets. But we also hope it provides a systemic check in relation to the way in which this decision and case has been handled by China, and can provide greater certainty in the long run for other sectors and ultimately perhaps other countries as well in relation to how such issues are considered and handled.
Minister, you're in your final days of the trade portfolio, which I'm sure you probably believe that. Can you just sort of, I guess, reflect on how things have got so badly with China, and in particular, I guess, the hypocrisy of them when you hear Xi Jinping give speeches and talking about free trade and keeping international commerce going, and yet here he is carrying on like a bully boy tactics, beating up on the small kid in the playground, which is what it looks like very much. Do you think the message is that China is just an unreliable business partner?
Well, if these are my final days in the trade portfolio, I'm not about to throw diplomacy out the door, much to your disappointment in the last few days. Look, we've seen, as I've reflected through the course of the year, that the risk profile of trading and doing business with China has grown throughout the course of this year. That the fact that China has accumulated a series of decisions that look like sanctions against Australia obviously changes that risk proposition for Australian businesses and industries as they choose to consider doing business with China. And it also has a knock-on effect in relation to others around the world. Australia is not the first country to see China apply different trade sanctions against them that appear to lack justification if you just look at the trade elements of the relationship. And so that heightened risk profile is one that all businesses around the world potentially face, which means it's a bad outcome for China and the Chinese economy, as well as for economies like ours around the world. That ultimately China faces the prospect that businesses making commercial decisions around the world will decide that there's a higher risk and potentially not worth the rewards that are there, and they will take their trade or investment avenues elsewhere. But China is also still the second largest economy in the world, the biggest consumer goods market in our region, a market with a burgeoning middle class, and unsurprisingly, given that scale, is the number one trading partner for us and for most other countries within our region, the vast majority of other countries within our region. So we are right to stand by our values, which includes the principles of supporting China's economic prosperity, which has achieved the miracle of our lifetime in lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and improving living standards for many as a result of that. We're right to stand by that as an objective worthy of continued pursuit and worthy of Australia continuing to seek to engage and support through a partnership approach. But none of that comes with a selling out of our values. None of that comes with Australia compromising in relation to our national security objectives. And ultimately, what is going to be required here is from Australia a period of calm, consistency and patience. And for China, we hope, to be willing to come to the table recognising that Australia is going to be consistent in all of our values, but that includes our willingness to engage with them. And we will sit down at any time to re-engage at the highest levels to try to work through these issues and to make sure that our peoples and our businesses who have for a considerable period of time built a strong relationship are able to get back onto that strong footing.
Minister, you say that we can your
Is the government making representations to the incoming Biden administration to quickly accelerate the appointment of those WTO appellate judges so that institutions such as the WTO can get up and running better than they have been under the Trump administration?
We've got many issues across a range of levels to talk to the Biden administration about as they take office. We'll have discussions in due course about the WTO appellate body, but right now we're at the very early stages of a potential dispute with China. Now moving into those formal consultations and then the appointment of a panel, as I outlined before. The prospect of an appeal is still quite some distance off. And as I stressed, we do, as a result of Australia and China and other countries cooperating in the WTO, have an alternate mechanism already available to us and agreed between us as to how such an appeal would be resolved.
You say that Australia is consistent with its values, that it respects the rules and it's transparent. But let me take you back to Eric's question. With regards to Mengniu Dairy, attempted takeover of Lion. Now, it had passed FIRB. FIRB had said no problem. The ACCC said there was no problem. The Treasury said there was no problem. And yet, for some undeclared reason, Josh Frydenberg blocked it. So aren't the Chinese right in being rather cross at our hypocrisy?
No, I don't think that's an appropriate way to present it, Andrew. In the end, as I said before, the vast majority of FIRB applications, of foreign investment applications, including the vast majority of China's applications, continue to be successful through our processes.
This one out last night.
I understand there may be a singling out in relation to one that was one of a few that was unsuccessful versus the many that are successful. China is an important part of our foreign investment landscape, by no means the largest. Our largest foreign investment is the United States, our second largest is the United Kingdom, our third largest is Japan, the European Union being essentially our fourth largest collectively without the UK as part of that mix. So we do see that China, I think, comes in at about number 6, but in all of those cases, the vast majority of applications are accepted, and Australia continues to emphasise that we are open and welcoming to foreign investment where it passes the national interest test, and we've demonstrated that by saying yes in the vast majority of cases. Thanks, everyone.